Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Moggcast. I'm Mark Wallace, the executive editor of Conservative Home, and joining me for the first time, not just Jacob Rees-Mogg, but also the leader of the House of Commons. Good to see you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very grateful that you're still inviting me to do the Moggcast. Now I'm bound by collective responsibility and I'm going to have to be extraordinarily boring.
Well, I'm also very much aware that I now have to make sure I abide by the correct grammatical and linguistic conventions of this office. We're meeting to illustrate a little bit to listeners who might have assumed that now you're in government, these podcasts wouldn't continue, to give them a picture where we're now in a new location. We're interviewing you in your office as the leader of the House office in Parliament. And there's been a lot of publicity, a lot of hoo-ha in the last few days about your early announcement within that office about the standard of language. But equally, some people have been hailing the return of kind of traditional, clear English. How would you say it's gone down?
Oh, it seems to have been very popular. It's interesting, the responses that one gets to something that is relatively minor. So it's worth explaining what happened. Where I came into this office and I was asked how I liked my letters to be done. And my parliamentary team had drawn up a list of words that, when they were in letters, tended to get crossed out. And they're mainly words that are either redundant. It's very rare that the word very is actually true. When people say they are very pleased, normally they're just pleased. And you get into this linguistic state of overexcitement that it's best to avoid and say what you actually mean. And then there are words that I thought, when writing to constituents, it's important that I write to them to make it clear that I am on my constituents' side and I am there to help, not to bamboozle with unclear English. So the word unacceptable is a word that people use in a mealy-mouthed way about something that is actually wrong. If it's wrong, say it's wrong. And so that's how the list came about, basically to try and provide clarity and pithiness to my constituents rather than as an absolute style guide. Though some of the letters that have been in the Telegraph and the Times are absolutely excellent. And for those people who are worried that I didn't have going forward on the list, can I reassure them that it was only on the list because it is so obviously the most dreadful phrase that it was unnecessary to put it on. But there have been lots of other phrases that people have written in saying, why on earth wasn't this on? And I agree with most of them. Going forward, I think, is a particularly loathsome and meaningless phrase.
Well, certainly Conservative Home bans phrases such as forward planning and past history for rather obvious reasons. I was going to say very obvious reasons, but rather obvious reasons we'll have to do. We've seen, I think I might say, Robert Buckland has now established another form of tradition by wearing his wig, the first occupant of his role in about a decade to do so, I think I'm right in saying. Are there ways in which you're going to bring some tradition to the actual role of leader of the House, the way in which you hope to kind of shape the House? I notice, if you don't mind me saying so, that on your desk you have, say, a copy of Debrett's Correct Form, a very well-thumbed copy of the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, but notably no computer.
Well, I have an iPad in a folder at the moment, which is sitting in my car because I was running a bit late when I came in. That's why it's still in my car. And I found at Somerset Cover Management, my business, which we used to do the Moggcast in, I've now obviously had to leave. I had a desktop computer, and I'm afraid I simply found that I used either my iPad or my mobile telephone much more often to look at things. It's just more convenient. I'm not sure the desktop computer is the future. So I think I may be more modern than you're accusing me of being.
There's a death knell for for a form of technology in itself. I broadly agree. I think a lot of people now work on the move, don't they? Which obviously isn't so convenient for. Onto the political. Are you still the chairman of the ERG?
I am, because Parliament isn't sitting, so there's no meeting of the ERG to elect a new chairman. But I don't expect to continue once we meet and elect a new chairman.
Okay, which will happen when
Parliament
sits again.
Resumes, yes. I think it is better for a ginger group to be chaired by somebody who is not a member of the government. I think people might worry that I was gone too native to run the ERG as effectively as a backbencher could.
Presumably it can be expected to continue as a rather vocal group in these crucial times. And obviously, Steve Baker, probably the other person along with you, who's very closely associated with it, is obviously still outside government. Have you had the chance to speak to him since the appointment of the new administration?
I speak to Steve regularly. He's a great friend as well as being a political ally. So yes, I've been very much in touch with him.
And is he well?
He's very well. Yeah.
It's quite fascinating, I think, within the Conservative Party, as you probably know, our surveys found that, say, 6 in 10 Conservative Party members or thereabouts said that they voted for the Brexit Party at the European elections. It's quite a stark illustration of discontent about missing the spring deadline on Brexit. And therefore, I think there's quite an important role of work of trust to be done. I think the new government shows quite a few signs of wanting to try and work quite hard to re-establish trust with the grassroots as well as with the voters. Do you feel that you have a kind of raven in the tower position? Because I think it's probably fair to say that some of our readers and some of our listeners probably see you as such in terms of knowing that all is well with Brexit by your continued presence in the governmental Tower of London.
I'm not sure how literally one should take that analogy, because I have a nasty feeling that the raven's wings are clipped to ensure that they don't fly away. So I don't think my wings have been clipped, though I'm obviously bound by collective responsibility. This question people put to me as I did meetings for the new Prime Minister during his leadership campaign. They said to me, can we trust Boris? To which my answer is, well, yes, and personally I do. I think he is deeply trustworthy, strongly believes in what he's going to do, and recognises the political risk of not doing it. And therefore everything comes together for us to leave on the 31st of October. But I completely understand the follow-up question I got from people was that I said to them they should believe Theresa May when she said we would leave on the 29th of March. And yes, I did. I was gulled. Her statements were very clear, and it turned out that she didn't mean what she said, and asked for an extension. I think it is inconceivable that Boris would do the same. I just don't think that is what he wants to do. And of course it is important and always was important, and we knew it was important really in 2016 to have a leaver running this process rather than a remainer. Somebody who thinks that leaving is an opportunity rather than a problem to be managed.
And therefore, by implication, there's 3 years of work to do in just 3 months effectively now. If Boris Johnson undoubtedly wants to leave by the 31st of October, is there, as it were, a backstop compelling him to do so? What's the bind-in on that? Mm-hmm. For example, would you anticipate resigning if it doesn't happen?
Well, I think work expands to fill the time available is the first point, and you've seen that with the European Union again and again. If you think the European Union could work out how to find 600 billion euros in contradiction of the treaties to bail out the euro, and got it done half an hour before the New Zealand markets opened, the EU can move quickly when it wants to, and so can the UK. So the fact that the work's been concertinaed isn't, I think, that much of a problem. On resigning, somebody called for me to resign as soon as I stepped to the dispatch box to answer questions as the new leader of the House. I think to talk about resigning for one's barely got one's feet under the desk is a little bit premature.
From from that kind of leaver's perspective in the country, looking at this government, people who feel they've had their fingers burned by Theresa May, and to a certain extent it's not very fair, I suppose, that a new government should have to account somewhat for the damage done by the failings of its predecessor. But nonetheless, it is the case that you have quite a difficulty, really, in re-establishing some of that lost trust in Parliament and in politics, as well as in the Conservative Party specifically. How do you think you can go about convincing voters of that? I had a conversation earlier this week with a very senior businessman, somebody who is naturally kind of soft centre-left, quite Remainy-minded, somebody with a lot of negotiating experience, who said it's completely right that no deal has to be the alternative. It's absolutely essential. You can't negotiate any other way. May was completely wrong about that. I understand it. But do you believe that this new government would really do it if it doesn't happen?
Oh, unquestionably. Unquestionably. And people should listen to what the government is saying, that if a deal is not done, we will leave on the 31st of October, come what may. The whole focus of the government is to ensure that it is ready to leave on the 31st of October, come what may.
Is there a way to persuade Brussels of the seriousness of that? Because they don't necessarily, given that there is sufficient kind of disconnect in understanding between Brussels and Westminster, that the EU institutions are convinced that what they've been offering is a greatly painful to them, excellent deal for us, even though in the UK it doesn't look that way. What can we do to really make them understand that we actually genuinely mean no deal?
I didn't want to accuse you of swallowing EU propaganda. They thought they'd won game, set and match in the withdrawal agreement. It wasn't painful for them at all. They got billions of pounds. They kept us tied into the single market and the customs union until they were kind enough to say we could leave, and the European Court of Justice would have been the senior court. So I don't think they ever thought there was any pain in agreeing that. Why should they believe us? Well, they should believe us because of our new leader, that the new Prime Minister is somebody of considerable force of personality who is not going to be browbeaten by them. They should believe us because of the appointment of Dominic Cummings, which seems to me to be exceptionally important as a statement as to what is going to happen. That ought to make the EU realise that it is not business as usual. It isn't a sort of wet establishment that will go along with Brino. It is a tough-minded, clear-sighted government that will accept a decent deal, a fair deal, but will not accept a bad deal and isn't frightened of leaving. The one thing they may find it hardest to understand in the European Union is that there are people in the United Kingdom who think that being outside the European Union is a wonderful state to be in. They are so committed to their own structure that they can't imagine a higher form of existence than being in the European Union. But people like me think being out of it is unquestionably better. And that is the view of the whole government. And therefore we're not frightened of the departure date.
If they can be convinced in the way you describe of the government's willingness to do that, I suppose part of where your new job comes into play in this is also convincing them of the government's capacity to do it in terms of when you spoke to the Telegraph the other day, I think they described it as you issuing a challenge to the so-called Gorkwood squad, that actually if they're serious about what they say, they would revoke vote to revoke Article 50, and they haven't done so far. Have you heard any more from them since you issued the challenge?
No. And this is really important because there's this constant chatter, which the EU may believe, that Parliament won't allow the UK to leave on a no-deal basis. This is not true. If any of them are listening, that the law for us to leave is in place. The only way to stop us leaving on the 31st of October is to change the law. And how can that be done? Well, the date can be changed by agreement within the Council, but that would require a change of Prime Minister. So that would be the vote of no confidence route, seeking to get a new Prime Minister. The second route is simply to revoke. There is no legislative means, short of revoke, that changes the date, because it would still require the Prime Minister to ask for it in Council. But they don't have the courage to say that, because they know that a lot of their voters are very strongly against revocation. And so the default position in law is that we leave on the 31st of October. It requires no further vote in Parliament to achieve this, and would require complex parliamentary mechanisms to stop it, which require a different government, of which there is no sign.
Does it concern you that the Speaker has shown some taste, should we say, for complex parliamentary mechanisms, or what he would probably describe as innovations in recent months?
No, I've said this to Mr. Speaker himself, and I've said it publicly before. But I think had the situation been reversed, had we had a strong Remain government, and I, as a Leaver, had found a parliamentary mechanism to do something that hadn't recently been done, Mr. Speaker would have been open to me to do that, as he has been to them to do what they have done. I think Mr. Speaker is genuinely fair-minded in what he seeks to do, and I think that his aim is to ensure that the House of Commons has the say that it wants. And there is, in fact, only one ruling of his that I disagreed with, and I raised a point of order at the time, and that is on the question of forthwith. I think forthwith has a different meaning from the one Mr. Speaker determined. But I think he would have done the same had the boot been on the other foot. And I think people miss this. Mr. Speaker is in favour of the House of Commons and the authority of the House of Commons. In that sense, he is not impartial. He is pro the House of Commons. But that is as Mr. Speaker should be. In terms of the political arguments, I think he is a fair-minded umpire.
Is there some risk that the proceedings, we've got a copy of Erskine May on the table between us, the actual hard rules and the actual official processes of the House of Commons are not always very well understood in the world outside Westminster? Indeed, they're not always well understood in all parts of Westminster. I can see you smiling, implying that. Is there some difficulty in the fact that actually if the House of Commons starts voting on theoretical votes, which aren't actually binding, votes to express its disapproval of things, and the government replies to say, well, actually, you may express your disapproval, but that isn't the same as the law, that actually the government may run close to getting its way, but actually it starts to lose the country?
Well, of course, debates in Parliament have a political influence even when they don't necessarily have a legal effect. But it is very, very important that law is done by legislation, not by mere motion. What do I mean by this? Well, the process for changing our law is complex, but it's complex as a protection. A government with a majority cannot come in, go into the House of Commons, and randomly change the law one day to the next. That means we have certainty as to what the rule of law is and that the rights of minorities are protected. If you were to allow law to be made by motion of the House of Commons, the House could sit tomorrow. It could change swathes of law, and suddenly we would have no certainty about our legal system or our democratic rights. That isn't democracy, that is arbitrary rule. And our system is there to prevent arbitrary rule. The formal voice of the House of Commons and the House of Lords is through legislation. What it passes as a motion is an interesting part of the political debate, but cannot and must not have the force of legislation.
And returning a little to, it's quite interesting, that question of reassurance for Eurosceptics and kind of sticking to the mission of getting Brexit done by the 31st of October. One thing which, we're recording this on Wednesday morning, one thing that we've had several emails and messages from our readers about this morning is some concern about the Prime Minister mentioning leaving the customs union and the single market in the next couple of years, presumably relating to transition. Is that something can you offer some reassurance from a Brexiteer perspective in this new Brexiteer government that actually there isn't the prospect of a kind of fudgy delay?
I'm absolutely confident there won't be a fudgy delay. We will leave on the 31st of October. That is absolutely clear. And the backstop will not exist in any new agreement that we come to. But the Prime Minister is still asking for an agreement. Could an agreement have an implementation period? Well, it might be wise to have one because the point of the backstop is for fear of what happens if you have a hard departure date, and that's why the EU has been arguing for it. Therefore, to allow the EU to match up with UK systems, an implementation period is not an outrage, but the terms of that implementation period are very important.
I'm aware that we're running a little short of time, with which you've been very generous. You mentioned that the backstop will not be part of it, so no backstop. This isn't a question of a backstop with a time limit or a backstop with some dilution. This is a question of the deletion of the backstop. Is that correct?
That's what the Prime Minister has said.
And he also said the withdrawal deal is dead and it's gone, so this wouldn't be simply the removal of the backstop from the text.
That is what the Prime Minister has said, yes, indeed. And I support everything, as you know, because I'm bound by collective responsibility,
Naturally.
but I take that bit of collective responsibility with enthusiasm.
You lean forward out of your chair in animation as you say it. And my final question, you mentioned him earlier, and he's somebody who specialises in putting his opponents on the back foot. And actually his very existence in Downing Street, I think I would suggest, has already done that. I'm speaking, of course, of Dominic Cummings. Now, in your role, you aren't a whip, you aren't responsible directly for the management of the parliamentary party, but you are responsible for the shepherding of government business through the House of Commons with the cooperation of the parliamentary party. Do you see any tension, potentially, between a Downing Street in which Dominic Cummings is a driving authoritative force and some parliamentary Conservative party in which he may have been somewhat disobliging about some of its members in the past?
No, I don't. I think politicians are thick-skinned a lot. They don't worry about these sorts of things. And the question is, are we getting in the right policy direction? And I'm very, very confident that we are getting the right policy direction and that Dominic will drive that. And that will overcome any offence given to people's amour propre.
And does it bring to mind for you memories of Vote Leave and the referendum campaign trail?
Well, not really, because during that, I mainly did my own thing. I mean, I went into Vote Leave a couple of times, and occasionally their press office asked me to do a couple of things. But most of the time, I did the invitations that I'd got to go off around the country, making speeches, the TV, radio, media bids that came in, I dealt with myself. And so I was a flying buttress as far as Vote Leave was concerned. I was more supporting from the outside than the inside.
Now, inside the structure.
Now inside the structure, yes, with, I hope, some structural purpose rather than a mere ornament.
And on that note, I think we'll wind it up there. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much.
For not just this episode, but for the continuation of the Moggcast. I'm sure our listeners will be very glad to hear what you've had to say today, and we will return, I believe, after recess.
Excellent, yes, thank you very much. Thank you for coming in.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.